For a while now, I've been wanting to talk about the doctrine of sin. Why? Because it's in the Bible. Because it's true. Because in some ways, our culture today is especially resistant to the idea. And what I thought would be an interesting challenge, and perhaps maybe it'll end up being more than that, would be to try to convince you that the doctrine of sin is good. It is a good doctrine. It's not a good thing, but the doctrine of sin is a good sin. A good sin, excuse me. Now that's going on YouTube. And I've been waiting 5 years for a slip-up that, so maybe I'll go viral, who knows. But the doctrine of sin is a good doctrine. It is something that is so true that the truth of it is good, even though the thing itself is really, obviously, very bad. Now, I feel like, as a pastor, one of the easiest parts of my job is demonstrating that the world is affected by sin. That is almost a no-brainer. It is an effortless thing. Somebody once said that proving sin is the easiest thing to do, but it's the hardest thing to convince people of. And I don't know, maybe that's true. I want to start, though, with a little illustration from the world of folklore, and most of you will be able to remember what fairy tale this is referencing, and I'm using this by way of just illustrating the idea of sin as a doctrine. This is, does anyone want to guess what fairy tale this is? See, you all know this, Rumpelstiltskin. Yeah. Now, the poor woman in the fairy tale didn't know what fairy tale she was in because the name is the thing she's trying to guess, right? So the story is that she was supposed to spin gold, and she didn't have the ability. Well, this little supernatural creature showed up and said, I can do it for you, but if I do, you owe me your child. And she's like, well, if I don't, I'm going to lose everything anyway, so yes. But can I get out of this? And he said, you can get out of this deal if you guess my name. Well, that's the kind of name that you have to be told. You can't guess that. It's not like George or Frederick or something. It's Rumpelstiltskin. Who names your kid Rumpelstiltskin? So anyways, she ends up coming up with the right name. And in the story, then everything turns out okay. And he ends up missing out on his opportunity to take her child and have a happy ending. And I was talking about this idea of the name, being able to name something, actually being important. And I was talking about that once with a doctor. And the thing that we came up with was, this is actually very, very true in the medical world. So let's say you wake up one day and you've got a random pain, and maybe you have no energy, and maybe you're a little bit shaky, and you don't know what the pain is, so you do what anybody would do in your situation, and you ignore it and hope it goes away. But let's say it doesn't. You wake up the next day. It's a little bit worse. So you then do what anybody would do, and you Google your symptoms. And you find out that it could be any one of 1,000 things. So you ignore it for another day, but it still doesn't go away. So then you finally do what everyone eventually does, and you go to your doctor. You explain your symptoms, the doctor listens to your heartbeat, takes your pulse, and asks you all these questions, and then takes some blood and sends it to the lab. And the doctor says, well, it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be the other thing. And if it's me, my first question is, can you help me? And the doctor is probably going to say, not until we know what this is. The diagnosis is absolutely crucial. If you don't know what that thing is, how can you give the correct treatment? Now, in our world today, like I said, it's the easiest thing to prove that things are not right. That pain and suffering and stupidity and inertia and conflict and all of these things are creating a turmoil in our world, and frankly, they're always doing that. Sometimes it's more pronounced than other times. Sometimes you're more aware of it. But the world is not the way it should be. And we know that, just from looking around. What could it be? What could the problem be with the world that we're living in? Well, there are people who have tried to diagnose what's wrong with the world. For example, more than 100 years ago, there was a guy who said, I know the problem with the world. The problem is class struggle. Rich people hate poor people hate rich people. If we can fix that, we will solve everything. Has not worked. Will not work because of the wrong diagnosis. We haven't got the name of the problem right. Some people will say the problem is intolerance. If we could all just learn to tolerate each other, our problems would be solved. I would love to live in a world where we all tolerate each other, but it's not going to solve our problems, because our problems run deeper than that. Some people will say ignorance is the problem. If we just educate everybody, if we make everybody smart, nobody will do anything stupid. The only thing that education will really do is make you smart enough to know that you don't know. And if you learn that, then you have been well educated. The Bible has a diagnosis for the problems of the world, and we see it among other places in Romans chapter 3, where it says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The world that we live in, and frankly, we ourselves, were intended to be glorious, full of life, fulfilled, obviously and quickly, latching on to our meaning, close to God, close to each other. None of those things are easy or automatic now. They only come at the cost of tremendous struggle and actually also the death of God Himself on the cross. The sin, even though this is an old-fashioned, antiquated term, it's a term that a lot of people don't like, sin is at the root of all of those problems. Now, if you go to church for any length of time in America, you're sure to run across a pastor somewhere who will tell you that the Greek word for sin is hamartia. That is true. It's a Greek word that refers to archery. You have a target, okay? And hamartia literally means you missed the mark. So you get your bow and your arrow, and you pull back, and you let fly, and it... you missed the mark. That is something like a definition. The thing about a definition is that it gets as small as possible and as precise as possible. But the Bible also gives us a description in addition to a definition. The difference between a definition and description is that a definition is very, very narrow. A description is very, very broad. If you ask me to define what is a woman, I say adult, human, female. If you ask me to describe what is a woman, I'm going to need more than 3 words. I may need to invent some words. And people have been trying to do that. Poets have been trying to do that for thousands of years, and they're still trying, because the description is much more than the definition. Therefore, in the Old Testament, for example, when it wants to talk about the problems that we're in, it doesn't use a narrow, defined word. It uses a mental image, a picture, a sort of a story. All we like sheep have gone astray. If you've ever tried to get 40 sheep to do one thing that you really need them to do, and I have done that. I had a pastor who was a friend of mine who was a literal shepherd, and he asked for my help one day with the sheep. And I learned more about pastoring that day than 3 years of seminary. It was amazing. And I saw myself in every one of those stupid, woolly idiots. And you're there. That's where you want to be. Every one of us go to our own way. This spreading out, this rebellious instinct we have, that's a good mental image, a good picture of sin, what sin is like. In other words, the idea of missing the mark is true. But sometimes you have to admit that there are a lot of people who aren't even trying to hit the target. That don't even believe the target exists or that it's valid. I'll make my own target. Watch out. Pretty good, huh? So sin is much more than just trying hard and not quite making it. Sin is also, well, I'm going to give you the only word that I really was comfortable with. After looking at some of the passages that describe sin, I've got to say, the Bible really presents sin as a monster. Something that is overwhelming and overpowering. Something that you can be responsible for and victimized by at the same time. Now let me give you a couple of passages that describe what I'm talking about. James chapter 1 says each person is tempted when he's lured and enticed by his own desire. That's your responsibility. The desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Oh, it grows, it kills you, it suffocates. You know, I was reading this week, and I'm not trying to be flippant, but as I was reading this once again, the only thing I could imagine that really captures this was the Alien movies, where there's something inside of you, tiny, and then it grows, and then it pops out of your chest, and it eats you. That's gross. But that's kind of what's happening here. It's terrifying. In Romans, sin is described as a taskmaster. When you were slaves of sin, you were free in regard to righteousness. In other words, even if you didn't want to do that sinful thing that you should have avoided doing, you almost didn't have a choice. You're almost powerless. Sin isn't just a standard that you missed. It's also got one foot on your neck and a rod or a whip in its hand, and it is oppressing you and forcing you, in a sense, to follow the path that you yourself have chosen. Here's another passage of Scripture from Genesis 4, and obviously this is God himself speaking to Cain. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you. Everything that's supposed to be good and life-giving about you, sin is contrary to that. Sin is destructive and corrosive. It's like an acid. It eats away at you. It diminishes who we are and who we're meant to be. It dehumanizes and destroys all things everywhere. We need, in some sense, a bigger understanding of sin. We need to see it as it really is. We need to understand all we like sheep have gone astray. Turn everyone his own way. And that the Lord has laid on him, referring to Jesus Christ, the iniquity of us all. In other words, the bigger sin really is, the more powerful the thing that handles sin. I want to spend some time talking about that. I want to spend some time talking about that because we are, all of us, weighed down by the weight of our own rebellion. Here's another little story to kind of help capture the mood. And this is the kind of story that can very easily get people in trouble these days because, well, reasons. I'm going to do it anyways because I'm fearless like that. Imagine your daughter comes to you, she's 19. I'm in love, she says. With who? With this guy who's covered with tattoos, been to jail 4 times, been married twice. His drug dealing is behind him. And his arrest record will be clear in 6 years. And he's got a motorcycle. So cool. Yeah, I'm trying to be a little silly. But really, every parent who has daughters knows a little bit how real that fear can become in just a single conversation. And anyone who has sons wants his son not to be the dude in that story, obviously. Well, your daughter does what everyone since Romeo and Juliet has done, and she runs off to Las Vegas. She gets married to this guy on the back of his motorcycle and comes back home just so happy because we're in love. All you need is love. What more could you possibly need? 3 years later, she calls you at 3 o'clock in the morning one day out of the blue, desperate for help, desperate to get away, carrying probably on her body the scars of the abuse that she's had to endure. Now, is she responsible for how he hit her? No. Is he responsible for how he abused her? No, that's not her fault. Is she responsible for the fact that she's married to him? Yeah, that was her doing. And it's just like that with sin. We are responsible for the rebellious attitude that puts us at the mercy of a monster. But, I mean, are we really responsible? Are we really responsible? Well, let me tell you why the doctrine of sin is a good thing. It's because the doctrine of sin cuts through the mystery of that kind of ambiguity, and it makes some things very, very clear. One thing that the doctrine of sin as a doctrine does, is that it preserves what is true. We know that it is true. We try to obfuscate it. We try to confuse and cloud the truth about sin with other words and other explanations and other possibilities. So it's possible for a person to have a mental illness or an emotional sickness, and that needs to be rectified. But that's not the base problem. The base problem is that that person who may also be sick is in rebellion against the Creator. And if you don't preserve that truth with this doctrine that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, then you're never going to reach the real root of what our problems are as individuals or as a society. 1 John 1, chapter 1, verse 8 says this. 1 John 1, 8 says, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. So we're lying to ourselves if we abandon or if we devalue the doctrine that all have sinned. But the doctrine of sin is also good because it has what I call explanatory power. It is possible to explain everything in the world with a really unbelievable explanation. Let me give you an example. Aliens. Why do we have pyramids? Aliens. Why do we have evolution? Aliens. Why do we have the world? Aliens. You watch the History Channel late at night, and you will see aliens being blamed for everything. That is not a good explanation for human history, for human existence, for the problems we have faced, or for the creativity that we have, shown in the course of our development as human beings. Well, if we look at the problems themselves and the difficulties that we have and the conflict in the world today, and even the conflict within our own souls, sin has the ability to explain that powerfully, to draw our attention to the real problem. And it doesn't have to be complicated. I hated algebra because there's letters. Math is supposed to be about numbers. And then you bring letters in, and you have to figure out what the X stands for. I don't care what the X stands for. I never cared. I flunked algebra twice. Once in high school, once in college. How did I ever become a pastor? There's no math in the Bible. It's all good. Well, the problems of the human experience are much easier to pinpoint as long as you understand that sin is at the root of those problems. Another reason that this doctrine of sin is good is because it points us to the true victory. It points us to the true victory. If your problem, we used the analogy of an illness earlier, right? So if you wake up, you got chest pain, and you go to the doctor, and the doctor says your problem is that you don't have enough life insurance. That'll be $500 please. You have been given a solution to your problem, but it's a bad solution because it's not going to address what's really wrong. One of the reasons the doctrine of sin is such a necessary truth is because it points us to the true remedy. Excuse me. In Romans, again, in chapter 5, it says this. I'm looking at Romans 5:21. As sin reigned in death, grace might also reign through righteousness and into eternal life through Jesus Christ, our Lord. The solution to sin is not to try harder, nor to deny that there's a problem. The solution is to be found in Jesus Christ. And if the Bible can explain what's wrong with us all, then the Bible certainly has the ability to point us to the one who can cure us all, forgive us all, restore all of us. And this leads me to the fourth thing that is so good about the doctrine, not the fact, of sin, and that is that it provides contrast. It provides contrast. What do I mean by that? Well, let me take you back to a story that you all remember from the pages of the Old Testament. There was a moment in the life of Israel as a nation when they had come up against an enemy that they could not defeat. These guys had chariots. The Hebrews had no chariots. These guys had iron. The Hebrews were struggling to find anything better than bronze. These guys had giants. The Hebrews did not. And one particular giant would go out and taunt them. He would, throw shade? Is that the word nowadays? I lose track of these slang terms, but I think that's what he was doing. He was trying to taunt and intimidate the Hebrews by making fun of them, by challenging them. Just one warrior to come and face me. And then I'll crush him, and then he'll be dead, and then you can be our servants, our slaves. Unless, of course, you defeat me. And there was not hardly a single Hebrew warrior willing to go down the valley and face that giant, except for one guy who did not have height advantage for sure. Didn't have a reputation. You know what he had? He had probably more than a dozen years worth of experience sending a stone at a very small target at probably roughly 90 miles per hour. And he had confidence that God had brought him to that place and time for that purpose. And you know his name is David. And he said, I'll do this. And his brothers said what older brothers, all good older brothers say, which is, you know what? Go back to your sheep, pansy. His king didn't have any confidence in him. He said, well, you know what? I better give you my armor just to be sure. And he was like, you know what? I'm not used to this. It's not comfortable. I'd rather just go. And out he goes. And the Philistines thought this was great humor. And the Hebrews, I don't know, they had to send somebody. I honestly don't know what they were thinking or feeling. Praying probably, oh God, please, 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 please let this work. Please let this work. Saul was thinking, okay, if this doesn't work, this is probably the end of my PR campaign for re-election. And down he goes into the valley. One stone, one sling, and the battle is over. And what were the people of Israel saying about David 24 hours later? They had written songs about him because they saw this great, big, huge monster that was impossible to defeat, hard to face, unimaginable in combat. And then they saw him knocked to the ground, and then they saw his head cut off. And they realized there is somebody on our side who can defeat that monster. And that's why we have songs today about David, but we don't have any songs about Goliath. Because Goliath lost. If the monster of sin, if the challenge of sin, if the burden of sin is so enormous, how much more powerful must Jesus Christ be, who conquered sin and death forever.
Amen.
How powerful must he be? How much must that victory provide to you and to me when we have to face not just the doctrine of sin, but the reality of sin every single day? Guys, sin is a big deal. And I hope you realize it's a big deal. It's a monster. But when you compare the challenge and the power of sin to Jesus Christ, there is no comparison. There's none. None whatsoever. And that's where I want to leave it today. Because if the doctrine of sin does anything good for us, it points us to the fact that Jesus Christ is so much more. And that's what we're singing about. Am I right?
Yes.
I'm right. Well, I know I'm right. But thank you for agreeing with me. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to pray. I'm going to ask our team to come back up here. We're going to close with a song. Heavenly Father,